The date is October 4th of 1957. World War II came to an end only 10 years before a new conflict began to arise. This conflict was the Cold War. The Cold War pitted the world's two largest forces, the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the USSR. One of the ways these two countries could compete with each other is through space exploration. On October 4th of 1957, a Soviet R-7 ICBM intercontinental ballistic missile launched Sputnik. Sputnik became the world's first artificial satellite and the first object that was man-made to be put into the Earth's orbit. The launch of Sputnik surprised most Americans. Due to America's grand tradition of exploration, many believed it was logical to explore the final frontier and not let the Soviets get too far ahead, and thus the space race began.
Less than a month after Sputnik launched, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2 on November 3rd, 1957. Sputnik 2 was the second spacecraft launched into Earth's orbit and the first to hold a living organism. This organism was a dog named Laika.
As a response to the Soviet Sputnik programs, the United States launched Explorer 1 on January 31st, 1958. Explorer 1's primary scientific instrument was a cosmic ray detector which measured the radiation environment in Earth's orbit. Soon after, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed a public order creating a federal agency dedicated to space exploration known as the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Alongside NASA, Eisenhower created two national security-oriented space programs which were the U.S. Air Force and the CIA.
Later that year, the United States launched Pioneer 1, which was the first spacecraft launched by the newly founded NASA. The Pioneer 1 was intended to study the ionization radiation, cosmic rays, magnetic fields, and micrometeorites in Earth's vicinity and in lunar orbit. That next year, on January 4th, the Soviet launched the Luna 1, which was the first spacecraft to reach the moon.
A month later, on March 3rd, the Pioneer 4 was launched by the United States, which was created primarily to photograph the moon up close. Although Pioneer 4 did in fact fly past the moon, a trajectory error caused it to fly at a much further distance than planned. On April 9th of that same year, the United States began Project Mercury.
Project Mercury was created to try to send man into space. This project brought in the Mercury 7, which was formed of 7 astronauts. These 7 were Scott Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, and Deke Slayton. The project did finally succeed on May 5th, 1961, by sending Alan Shepard into space, but it was not before the Soviets became the first.
With the use of the craft Vostok, Yuri Gagarin became the world's first man in space on April 12th of 1961. Before the Vostok, though, the Soviets launched Luna 2, which became the first craft to land on the moon's surface on September 13th of 1959. Luna 2 was followed by Luna 3 on October 4th of 1959. Luna 3 was the first ever mission to successfully return images of the far side of the moon.
On August 19th, 1960, the U.S. Air Force launched a spacecraft named Discoverer 14. Discoverer 14 was used for surveillance because its primary goal was to develop a film return of photographic surveillance to assess how rapidly the Soviet Union produced long range bombers and ballistic missiles and their deployment locations.
The next step for the United States, as boldly claimed by President John F. Kennedy, was to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. This claim led to the creation of the Gemini program in 1961. The main objective of Project Gemini was to support Apollo's missions to land astronauts on the moon by developing space travel techniques. Gemini achieved long enough missions for a trip to the moon and back, used extravehicular activity that perfected working outside the spacecraft, and pioneered orbital maneuvers that were necessary to achieve space rendezvous and docking. After the perfection of these techniques, the Apollo missions could begin.
The Apollo program's main goal was to safely land Americans on the moon and to return them safely back to the Earth, but it also extended past just that. The Apollo program also wanted to establish a technology to meet other national interests in space, establish preeminence in space for the United States, carry out a program of scientific moon exploration, and to develop man's capability to work in a lunar environment. The Apollo program led to 12 Apollo missions, which were Apollo 1, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. After many tested Apollo missions, Apollo 2 manned by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon, and soon after became the first man in the world to walk on the moon on July 16th of 1969.
While the United States focused on the space probes, the Soviet Union launched Venera 3 and Venera 4. Venera 3 was launched November 16, 1965, and was built to explore the surface of Venus. Venera 3 landed on Venus on March 1, 1966. However, the communication system failed before any planetary data could be returned. Then there was Venera 4, which launched June 12, 1967, which also was created to explore Venus. This time, the probe was successful and became the first to perform an in-place analysis of another planet's environment.
In July of 1975, the Apollo-Soyuz test project was conducted. The Apollo-Soyuz test project was the first joint United States-Soviet spaceflight and the last flight of an Apollo spacecraft. The primary purpose of this project was to symbolize the policy of relaxation that the two superpowers were pursuing at the time, which marked the end of the space race.
The real challenge that we coped with was the challenge of Sputnik, the international competition with the Soviets. They're putting a dog in space, then Yuri Gagarin, and made one orbit before we could even make a suborbital flight. But then, less than a month after that, the president said we're going to send a man to the moon and bring him back safely. And this was in May of 1961. There was an excitement. There was a pioneering challenge. And despite the setback of the Apollo fire in January of 1967, just 2.5 years before we actually made the landing, despite that setback, we put things together, and the teamwork that was associated with the cooperation of industry, academia, the politics, and everybody was we're all caught up with the challenge of success, and I think that it's that awareness and that novelty, that international competition that spurred on to give us the teamwork that resulted in the world's most significant rocket engine development. The Saturn V rocket is what made the difference. The spacecraft could be developed in different ways and could carry out the mission, but without the lifting capacity of that rocket, that's what made the difference between American success and Soviet failure. And that's going to be very crucial as we develop the rockets that are needed to carry out a return to the moon challenge within the next 10 to 15 years. And I think we need to use what we already have, the heavy lift rocket that gets the orbiter. We need to retire that orbiter and then use that as the launch rocket, upgrade it, improve it. Even as we improve that rocket, it's not going to be as powerful as the Saturn V, so we really have quite a challenge to be able to get back to the moon in an economical fashion without the international competition spurring us on. It's a big challenge, but it's going to be a very interesting 10 to 15 years to see how we get back to the moon and on to Mars.
In conclusion, the space race ties with the theme exploration, encounter, and trade because it was the United States and the Soviet Union's major leap into the exploration of space, the moon, and even other planets. Through the space race, both the United States and the Soviet Union encountered the final frontier firsthand. Finally, the United States and the Soviet Union experienced trade through the space race. During the process of creating the crafts, when the scientists exchanged ideas to better their work.